Welcome back to the Humble Market Timer YouTube channel. Once again, if you enjoy the content, please like, comment, and subscribe. In today's video, I want to look at Meta and where I believe is the no-brainer place to buy. Before I go any further, here's my disclaimer. Once again, these are my sole ideas, not investment advice. Now, normally in these videos, I tend to talk a little bit about the company, but I think we all know who and what Meta is. We know they're the parent company of Facebook, Instagram. They have just a truly great business. They are a part of the mega cap companies that have pretty much carried the stock market over the last 3 to 4 years. But recently, they have had a little bit of suppression in their price. And I want to talk about that briefly and see where would be a good place to buy. Now, they recently had an earnings report. And to me, I look at the earnings report and it was, phenomenal in my opinion. I mean, this is a company that's on pace to make about $200 billion in 2025. They've got 40% margins, just a phenomenal business. But the stock got hit. And the reason the stock got hit was because the thought was investors are being concerned that Meta is spending so much on CapEx or capital expenditures to prepare for the AI race. And they've been borrowing money, and they've stated that they're going to increase CapEx even more next year. And the CapEx this year has pretty much come close to, or is going to come close to doubling what it was last year. So a lot of people are concerned that, are they spending so much that it is going to eventually take away from the overall profits and the great earnings that we have in the business. And so as a result, it's had a pretty good pullback. It peaked just under, right around $800, just about in about August of this year, and it has since pulled back. We're now trading at about $619, so it's had about a 22% pullback since it's reached its highs. But I want you to look at the chart. This is the weekly chart, and you can see based on the weekly chart that it's been trading in a pretty defined uptrending wedge pattern. We had a peak here back in February of 2025, and we dropped quickly to the bottom of the wedge pattern in April, and then we went right back up to the top back in August. So based on the uptrending wedge pattern and the 20% pullback that we've recently seen in Meta, again, there's nothing wrong with the business. Business is booming. Revenues keep increasing. Great margins. Nothing wrong with the business. Really, the only concern is the spending. But if you look at the uptrending wedge pattern, the ideal point for that wedge pattern to eventually, or for the price action to eventually hit, is the lower portion of this wedge pattern, which would be right around in the 580, 570 price range. And to kind of verify that even more, I want you to really look at not just this pricing up here, but look at the RSI. Now notice the parallel in the price action in the RSI, which tends to dictate buyer and selling momentum, not necessarily price action. But in the last 2 years, this parallel that I drew in the RSI has accurately predicted the tops and bottoms each and every time of Meta's price movement. Let me show you what I mean. If you look here, where we topped here at the top part of the parallel, that represented the top of the price action back in April of 2024. When we hit the bottom of the parallel, that was the biggest dip that we had off that top that we had in April. And then we hit the bottom of the parallel again once here, and you see we hit the bottom of the price action here. Went all the way back to the top back in February 2025, top part of the parallel. What does that represent? The top part of the price action in Meta. When we dipped down to the bottom of the wedge pattern, and that was the bottom of the price action, lo and behold, it was the bottom of where the weekly RSI parallel that was drawn hit as well. And then, once again, when we went back to the top of the RSI parallel, that represented the top and that 800 level that we reached in Meta back in August. So each and every time in the last year and a half or so, when we have hit the top of the parallel in the RSI, that has represented the top in the price action of Meta. And every time we've hit the bottom, that has represented the bottom. Look at what we have done now. We have, once we hit the top of the RSI in August, of that parallel, we have slowly started to grind back down, and we are starting to make our move back to the bottom of the parallel of the RSI. And if you see, the parallel of the RSI is at about 39.40-ish right about now. And I believe it's going to eventually work its way down to the bottom of the parallel in the RSI. And I think that will correspond to the bottom of this uptrending wedge pattern that we have here. So, in my opinion, this chart and how accurate the RSI has predicted tops and bottoms of price action, it is screaming for you to buy Meta once it gets to that 570-ish price range. Now, if we have, if you notice, the market has kind of been, looks like it's starting to get a pullback, that will help bring Meta down even further to that 570 range. Now, if we get a massive pullback, then there's a possibility that this area won't hold and will go down to this line. And I'll kind of show you what this line down here represents. But before I do that, again, price action, it looks like it's headed to this trend line of the uptrending wedge pattern, and I believe it's going to correspond to the RSI lower portion of the parallel. Now, just to kind of give you some idea of what I think could happen, let's draw some pictures. You have again, I believe this price action, again, as a weekly chart, will eventually work its way down here. And at the same time, I think the RSI will work its way down here. And then I believe it will get a bounce. And I think one of two things will happen. I think once we get this, hit this area, we'll have a bounce. And we'll bounce either to here, and we'll kind of do this, and then retest that line once again. And that would also represent a bounce in the RSI. To about probably maybe the midpoint of the parallel. And then at that point, if the market is still a little weak, you might start seeing it fade here around the middle of the parallel. So that's one scenario. That would be a scenario where if we get maybe Santa rally at the end of 2025, that could represent this push that we have once Meta finds its bottom, and that would be, about a 20% move, which would be a pretty good move over a short period of time. So that is one possible scenario. Let me erase this. And then also erase this. Another possible scenario would be that we bounce from this lower portion of the uptrending wedge pattern and we go all the way back to the top part of the uptrending wedge pattern, which would give Meta a new high over 800 once again to round out the end of the year or to the beginning of 2026. And then at that point, we will retest this lower trend line again. And if it doesn't hold, then we'll work our way down to this bottom line. So those are, to me, the two possible scenarios. And I want to again show you what this bottom line represents. If you zoom out one more time to the monthly chart, you can see this is the monthly chart. So it shows you the price action in Meta from its very inception back in the early 2010s. And as you can see, for the most part, for the first maybe 10 years of Meta, or first 7 to 10 years, the price action trended very steadily in a very systematic uptrending pattern, and then we had a breakdown in the pattern of that uptrend, and then the move higher really kicked into gear back in 2020, late 2022, and then we had this massive rise in Meta after we came out of that dip. Now, typically when you have this massive move, things tend to want to eventually work themselves back down to the original uptrending trend line. And I believe if we have weakness in the overall market, you will see that Meta will eventually break down out of this uptrending wedge pattern. Uptrending wedge patterns are typically considered bearish, even though it does. A lot of people say, well, it's uptrending, how could it be bearish? Typically, those patterns eventually break, and they typically break down. Now, sometimes they can break up, but generally speaking, oftentimes they break down. So you could possibly see in 2026 a retrace back to this natural trend line. Even though Meta's business is great, they've already talked about increasing their CapEx even more in 2026. If the thought of CapEx being increased caused this recent decline in Meta, just imagine what it could do in 2026, particularly if the overall market is in a bit of a decline. So be on the lookout for an eventual pullback to this main line, but in the short term, look for Meta to trend lower to that 575.80 range, and in my opinion, that is a no-brainer buy. Hope you like the content. If you like it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.